everything gauges in this video.
The pros and cons,
What they actually mean,
how to read them,
the abbreviations and the critical ones and the most important gauges.
and what we consider not so great from factory.
Yeah, what is useless from factory?
We'll discuss that.
Let's get into it. I'm going to take all the practical side and all the actual use in the field experience and bring to you guys, and Trav's gonna.
We're going to run you through the technical side, what's going to be practical for you in the end, and we'll do an overview, see where we go.
With the overview, we're going to score everything from 1 to 10, both of us, and then we're going to add the combined score up, so at the end you'll have a large sheet of which gauges we consider are most important and most practical, and you'll know exactly what you should need, and you'll also know about those gauges that are absolutely useless from factory.
Pretty much, yeah. There's a few out there that need a little bit of work and refining.
One last thing I want to mention, all abbreviations will be explained to you as well, so you're going to know exactly what EGT means and all the other ones as well. We're also going to talk about multi-purpose stuff. Stay tuned and be enlightened. EGT, exhaust gas temperature. Don't confuse that with EGR, which is exhaust gas recirculation. EGR is nothing you can gauge. What it is part of your emissions. It recirculates the gas through your vehicle. That's pretty much the end of that. But EGT, exhaust gas temperature, that's what we're talking about here. In my case, this is one of my most important and critical gauges. I use it when I'm use it every day driving really, but especially when I'm towing up hills, I am driving low range or even high range on the beaches and the vehicle is labouring very hard. Just any off-road situation where it's mainly going up hills and driving on beaches. This is where your vehicle is under load and you're revving high. What it's doing is it's telling you the exact temperature that's coming through your exhaust gas. Now when that temperature gets too high, and Trav will tell you the critical temperatures of it, you get a warning. And you know when to back off your vehicle. You know when to maybe switch from low range to high range or high range to low range when you're on the beach to try and save your engine from over revving and over labouring itself. It's also a bit of a preview of what your water temp's going to do, because with hot EGTs follows hot water temps as well. To me, as you know already, EGTs are very important, especially for diesel engines or high power petrol. So therefore, I'm going to rate it 9.5 out of 10.
All right, EGTs, late model versus early model. The older cars didn't have DPFs on them. Manufacturers didn't use EGT probes, so you had to put in a bung in the exhaust, put your probe in there and mount gauges on a pillar pod. Now a lot of the later model cars with DPFs, manufacturers have sensors in the exhaust. If not, my 200 series has 6 EGT probes. We've coupled that with a scan gauge. We've programmed it to read the sensor, so it's easier to fit. And it's a simple fix. It's a much cheaper option, so that probably is a pro for a DPF model car versus an early model car, and it gives me the real-time reading and I can see exactly what the ECU is reading. EGTs and temperatures, pretty much in a nutshell, EGTs are going to go up as you're accelerating with the vehicle. So as the car's accelerating through the driving range, if you're overtaking, the EGTs are going to raise. It's about stabilising the EGTs. Short term, high EGTs is okay. Long term, no. That's something you need to look at, modifying the vehicle so you can get it to run cooler. When it comes to where you're going to take the temperature reading from, you've got pre and post turbo. Look, to be realistic, most people are going to have an aftermarket exhaust on their vehicle. Any good exhaust manufacturer is going to have an EGT Pro bung welded in. Hopefully it's in the right location that obviously you can slide the probe into it. It's not near the firewall, it's somewhere easy and accessible. So literally take the grub screw out, put the probe in there, couple that up to your gauge. When I talk about getting it in the right location, temperature reading, depending where you mount it, will change what the gauge reads. So best advice I can give you is right up close to the back of the turbo. It's the most practical and the best reading we can get out of it. And obviously get to know what your vehicle is temperature wise. If it's running hot, you're probably going to look at some options, either modifications on the vehicle to make it run cooler, air in and air out, or detuning the vehicle, or changing the load that you've got on the vehicle. So just touching on that as well, with tuning, guys, you know, if you've got large full height off-road caravans, headwinds, driving terrain, you know, obviously you never get a chance to coast when you're on corrugated tracks. You're always under load on the engine, and on the highway, if you've got crosswinds, headwinds, it is going to make a difference to how hot that engine runs. you need to tell or talk to the person that's tuning and modifying your vehicle. Be upfront and real what you're going to use the vehicle for. It will determine how hot your car will run. There's no point trying to get the maximum amount of power and torque out of the car if it's not sustainable. It's about making usable and drivable torque and power. So obviously you get the best of both worlds, and it's safe, and it's, you know, you're not going to have any dramas moving forward. So EGT and my rating, I'd have to say a 9.9. It's very critical.
Fuel gauge, not much to say here, unless you get a custom fuel tank or an aftermarket fuel tank. Aftermarket fuel tank is probably the better word, not a custom tank. Aftermarket fuel tank. If they use your original sender, you are not going to get an accurate reading. I would always suggest to get a gauge that actually reads properly, because I've had this issue a couple of times. This is the third time my fuel light's come on. We've drained my auxiliary tanks 3 times now. I've got a problem with the back. I've got a new fuel tank in. It's a 180 litre fuel tank. The gauge won't even reach to empty and you run out of fuel. That's not a good thing. Also, you can have other tanks where you're sitting on full for a very long time. You do 400, 500 Ks in, and then the gauge only just starts moving. What I would suggest here is when you do get a new fuel tank, if possible, get a whole heap of jerrys, fill it 20 litres in at a time, and then see where the gauge is moving. It's a long, tedious thing, so that's all I can say about fuel gauges, and of course they're very important, if they read accurately, that is. So I'm going to give a fuel gauge a 9 out of 10.
Fuel gauges and your vehicle, like Ronnie mentioned, long range tanks, you need to cycle through that tank a couple of times, work out where your increments work and how many litres that references to. And then that'll change again with driving conditions as well. So to back that, I generally want to find out where the fuel light's going to come on with your long range tank and how many litres that references to. Is it 10 litres? Is it 30 litres? And is it usable fuel as well? Can you pick up that fuel from the bottom of that fuel tank? Even though you've got 20 litres in there, can it actually get it to supply the engine? Because without it, you're going nowhere. Another thing to aid with that, fuel monitoring. Look, the manufacturers generally put something into the dash and it calculates this and that. Look, as you probably know, not that accurate. I prefer to put in how many litres you put in the tank, how many kilometres you've done, and your driving conditions. The scan gauge can calculate some of that for you, but get to know your car, how much fuel it uses. Make that assumption yourself, because there's not much fun getting caught on the side of the road with a quarter of a gauge and no fuel. So fuel gauge, I'm going to have to say it's an 8 out of 10, because without fuel you're not going anywhere. It doesn't matter about any other gauge. If that fuel gauge doesn't read right and accurate, you're not going anywhere.
The voltmeter. This is an oil gauge, we're going to pretend it's a voltmeter. So you have your analog style, you also have your digital style like this, and then you have your multi-purpose device like the scan gauge. They will all give you a reading. Now the one that's factory in your vehicle, if it's one of those analog gauges like this, you are not going to know if it's 11.8 or 13.2 volts or 12.6. You're not going to know the exact figure. However, it does give you a decent indication of wherever you are overcharging or if your battery is somewhat flat, because you get used to where the needle normally sits. The problem with your factory voltmeter is the fact that when you switch the vehicle off, it's not on. You can't see how much power is in your battery when you are stationary. If your vehicle only has one battery, you don't really need an additional voltmeter. The one that's in your car is fine. You don't really need to know. However, if you do have multiple batteries, that's where you need a digital volt gauge, so you can tell exactly how many volts are in your battery and what the state of charge is. I use mine for my secondary and my third house battery. So I have 2 batteries in the front. I monitor one of them on a red LED that's very nice and bright. I can see it. And when a vehicle is parked up, it still remains on. I can see what the power's like. I can see if I need to switch the car on to give it a charge. I can see if the solar's working. A lot of benefits for having a volt gauge. My rating is a 7.5 out of 10 for the voltmeter, if you have more than one battery.
Voltmeter, volt gauge, how it's displayed and what you should be looking for. Look, in my opinion, generally speaking, the charging system's either charging or it's not charging, which will fall back on your factory dash. You'll generally have an alternator light, so when you start the car, the light will go out. The alternator's charging, it's producing an output. Hopefully your battery's absorbing it. Generally speaking as well, you may have some sort of digital display like a scan gauge or a voltmeter that will give you a 12.6, a 13.4, whatever you're charging it at. Ideally, you'd want to see 2 battery voltages, because to me it's important if you've got 2 batteries, you want to see exactly what each battery's getting. Most times charging systems are separated as well. If you're running BCDCs, it's important to see that that system's charging as well. If you're not monitoring all of your battery banks, I don't really see the voltmeter as an important gauge, because the only one you're monitoring is the alternator charging your main batteries. The voltmeter in your charging system is only half the equation. If you can monitor the amps, that's the side that I prefer to watch, because that's the amount of energy that's coming in and coming out. It gives you a lot more detailed information of how much power you actually really are consuming and you are producing. To monitor that though, you generally need a lot more sophisticated, high-end battery management systems, but that's my preferred method. So a voltmeter on its own, without all the other high-tech stuff, I'd rate it a 5 out of 10. It's either working or not working.
Coolant water temp, often known as cold water temp, but that's actually incorrect. So it's coolant water temp. On your scan gauge, CWT. This is probably the most important gauge to me. If you're driving your vehicle around out in the outback or wherever you are, even on the freeway in peak hour traffic or whatever, if you have an analog gauge and it gets to red, it's already too late. You've already cooked the motor. Your kettle has boiled. So there are a lot of makes and models out there that have these kind of heating issues. So there are a lot of aftermarket things you can put into your vehicles. For example, you see a lot of patrols and a lot of Jeeps getting around with like a buzzer that's set to a certain temperature, so you know when to turn the vehicle off before it overheats. But if you go by that gauge, it's too late. Therefore, I use a scan gauge in mine. I can keep an eye on it, and I've even been able to, from this gauge, been able to tell when I need to clean my radiator or request a radiator clean when I get my vehicle serviced. Because a lot of mud and a lot of other stuff, foreign matter can get in there, and the more stuff you got in there, the hotter it's going to run. So having one of these scan gauges going up and down hills, you can really see the numbers climbing. When you're on the throttle, when you're off the throttle, you can see the temperature changing. So this is real time temperature, but the analog gauge is no good. Another good thing I use the digital monitoring for, if we are halfway through a full drive trip and we start the cars in the morning, I'm not going to just hit this big ass hill at 40 degrees coolant temp, because I want the motor to heat up first. So that's another way I use it as well. Also with the EGT on the beach run, also use the coolant water temp. So you can kind of monitor everything real time on one of these. My rating for a CWT, a coolant water temp, is going to be 9.9 out of 10.
Coolant temperature, and first thing in the morning, cold starts. Believe it or not, most of your engine wear is going to happen when the engine's cold. Getting that vehicle up to operating temperature, some cars do just have a blue light, which will mean that the engine is not up to operating temperature. That blue light will go out when it's up to running temperature, and then you won't see another light until you see a red light, which means it's overheated. Not a great factory display in my opinion. That's why I would actually opt to go for something that's going to give you a digital display that's going to tell you it's at 40 degrees, 60 degrees, 70 degrees. You'll know where your car operates at a daily basis, and also when you're towing up hills and off-roading, you'll get a pretty good indication of what's healthy and what's normal for your vehicle and what's abnormal, and when you need to look at, like Ronnie mentioned, servicing the radiator, looking at other mods, and so forth. When it comes to factory gauges on the dash, when you do have a gauge, generally you've got a cold line, a quarter, a 3/4, and hey, I'm hot, pull over, we've overheated. What do those lines actually represent? Well, who knows? You don't know until you have a digital display and you can actually see that line, it's 60 degrees, that line it's 70, that one it's 85, and that one's 110. That's where it comes down to knowing exactly what temperature you have. And to back that as well, generally what I would say to you is, if you're accelerating, you're going up over a hill, your cooling system is healthy. When it does exert, say it might get up 10 degrees more than what it normally operates. It's how quick it comes back down to temperature. That's how efficient your cooling system is. That's completely normal. It's when you go to overtake something or work the engine hard and it sits at 10 degrees more than normal, but it takes half an hour to come back down. That's when you know your cooling system more than likely is going to need some service. Pretty much coolant water temperature, I would have to rate it high as long as you can read it in a digital format, real time, not just a gauge. You know, that's inaccurate. If you've got the digital side of it, I would rate it at probably an 8 if you've got EGTs, and if you don't have EGTs, I'd have to rate it as a 10. It's a bit contradictory there, but depends what other gauges you've got to look at.
Boost gauges and your four-wheel drive. Now, I have a boost gauge in my vehicle and I don't consider it very important. In my opinion, the best way to read a boost gauge is to actually monitor it when you're driving. See what it's doing when you're on the highway, see what it's doing when you're off-road, especially in low range, because you get to know where the boost is sitting. You need to know this because otherwise that gauge is basically useless. Because when something else is going on, like you have an air leak somewhere or you have a blocked air filter, you'll then notice maybe 1 or 2 pounds less than normal, then you'll know you may need to look at something. But most of the time you can hear it anyway if you've got a bad blockage, or you can feel it in the power anyway. But a boost gauge is just that other thing that can confirm there's something going on. Now, if your boost gauge is on 0, well then, you know, you've got an air leak somewhere or something's happened, or maybe one of the hoses have come off. We've capped the boost at a safe level for my turbo, but nonetheless, I don't like keeping the boost up at 20 pound for too long. And I can manipulate my foot a little bit and then bring the boost back down to like 16, 15, somewhere about there. So it's just a peace of mind. My rating for a boost gauge in your four-wheel drive, or my four-wheel drive, is 2 out of 10. I don't think it's that important.
All right, boost gauges, mechanical versus electronic. 2 things I really want to touch on here. A mechanical gauge is my preferred method because it's real time and you actually see how quick the engine will respond to the turbo response and how the engine's tuned. When I say mechanical, it's a hard line that this is an oil pressure gauge. I'm just saying it's a mechanical gauge. You have a line out the back of here. It'll be plumbed in directly, ideally to the map sensor, which is where the ECU is taking its reading from, and you'll actually have boosted air pressure plumbed into the cab, and you'll see this needle moving real time to how the turbo's responding. That's my preferred method. That's what I personally like. The other way electronically is this is a digital version in a readout, whereas you can actually have a digital version in a gauge. But what that means is you plumb in a sender, so a sensor in the engine bay, and then you run wires into the cab. I generally find they're a bit slow, they're a bit dampened, and they're a bit jittery. They're not my ideal pick. Some manufacturers do go for that. So me personally, mechanical boost gauge plumbed into the cab, can't go wrong. The only downside is, yes, the line can come off at the engine where you're plumbing in. If you use quality fittings, not plastic, use brass or stainless fittings, you won't have that issue. It does give you early indications of, you know, is the turbo doing what it needs to do? Have you got air in? Have you got a blockage? Have you got a pipe off? Is that why the engine's running hot EGTs? Because you don't have the boost pressures to match the fuel curve. Another one as well, what you need to look out for when buying your gauge. Resolution. Obviously, if you've got a petrol engine, you are going to have vacuum. Diesels don't have vacuum, so there's no point buying a boost gauge that's got a vacuum reading on it, because it's never going to use that part of the gauge. So it's only going to start from the 0 point. And now this is the other one, going forward with boost, the resolution. Do you need a gauge that goes from 0 to 15 pound, 0 to 30 pound, 0 to 45 pound? That is determined on how much boost pressure you're running in your engine. Me personally, I like the most efficiency with the least amount of boost, which means you have the most amount of airflow. That's just my opinion. Everyone has their own philosophy as a tuner out there, but flow's better than pressure. In a nutshell, boost gauge, 5 out of 10.
RPM, revolutions per minute or rotations per minute, whatever you want to call it. What do you actually use it for? Look, I'll be honest, on the highway, I couldn't give two craps about what it says. I can feel what the car's doing. I know what gear to be in on the highway. I do that by feel. But when I'm off-road, however, especially in low range, I do actually check my RPM, because I know that my maximum power and peak torque is at 2200. So when I'm going over obstacles and stuff, you learn quickly where to find the right gear in low range to hold that. You also learn your stall point, which is very different in high range to low range, I'll tell you that. The other reason why I have it on scan gauge is when we're driving down the highway, my gearbox is different to Torben's gearbox or Travis's gearbox. they have modern gearboxes. They've changed the gearbox in my particular make and model, just in case you didn't know. We can kind of reference to what RPM is sitting in this gear. It's not really for any technical reason. We just want to know. RPM, I'm going to rate that on this score of 3 out of 10.
RPM and your vehicle, something I've come across from customer feedback is people with a 6-speed automatic gearbox, they think they're going to tow their vehicle in 6th gear at 1400 RPM. No, the engine can't make torque that low unless you've got something astronomical going on there. Generally around that 1700 RPM, you're probably going to be around your sweet spot. Digital format or a tacho on the gauge is going to help you select the right gear to minimize engine load, maximize engine torque. So just a bit of an indicator there, or if you've got a lock-up kit as well. So you're operating the engine in that sweet spot, so to say. So RPM, overall, I'd have to say it's probably a 2 out of 10, because once you know your vehicle, you don't really need to look at it. So 2 out of 10 for an RPM.
Oil pressure. Well, I'll leave most of this to Trav. What I do know though, if the light comes on, you're not getting enough oil pressure to your vehicle. Now, I've had the light come on my vehicle a couple of times, and that is due to being on severe angles. And if you're on a severe angle for a long period of time during a recovery, just switch your car off, because when that oil light comes on, it means you don't have enough oil, and not having enough lubricant inside your engine, well, I think we all know it's not good. Oil gauge, in my opinion, I don't really know how to read it, and it does high pressure, low pressure. I'm gonna give it a 1 out of 10 because I don't understand it, but I'll give my oil light 10 out of 10.
Oil pressure gauges and mechanical versus electronic. Now, I'm gonna backflip on this. With an oil pressure gauge, I much prefer an electronic gauge, which means you have a sender mounted on the engine, like so here in the packet here, and then you run wires into the cab to an electronic gauge. Now the reason for that is we're not going to plumb in a hard line into the engine's oil pressure, run it into the cab, especially on a full drive with things moving, rubbing, because if that line rubs through, you're going to have oil everywhere in your cab. Reading the oil pressure gauge, generally you've either got oil pressure or you don't have oil pressure. The things that are going to change the oil pressure is ambient temperature, and also cold start and operating temperature, the two different weights of your oil. So what you want to look for when it's cold, obviously you're going to have a little bit more oil pressure. When it's operating at normal operating temperature, it is going to drop a little bit. Having the oil pressure gauge will help you decide on what oil viscosity you need to suit your climate and where you're operating at. If it's too thin in a hot climate, it's not so great, and if it's too thick in a cold climate, not so great as well. It's finding that happy medium. Engine lubrication, the key is to get it efficiently through the engine and getting it cycled. In a nutshell, oil pressure gauge, look, it's not a must. It's a good thing just to know what it is, and once you know with your climate, nothing really changes. You either have it or you don't have it, generally speaking. I'm going to go with a 3.5 out of 10.
Your speedo on your 4-wheel drive. Of course it's important because you've got speeding fines to pay if your speedo's out. You see, if you put bigger tyres on your vehicle, your speedo is going to be out. It could be out from anywhere from 5% up to 15%. Mine's somewhere in between 11 and 15%, that's quite a bit. I then have to gauge my GPS to see how fast I'm actually going. But after a while, you kind of learn with your gauge. Just something to be aware of there. Also, your odometers won't rack up to what they truly are. And your odometer is pretty damn important too. But I'm gonna give that, in relative to everything, because you can use your GPS instead, I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10.
Speedos and your 4-wheel drive. If it's mechanical, you can re-gear it. If it's electronic, there is speedo correction units that you can adapt to your particular vehicle if they are available. I'm for them because it does keep the odometer true to what the vehicle has traveled. So you can put a maintenance program in place. It can be structured and it's correct. It's not 15, 10% out. And the other one is too, if you're planning a trip and you know the distance from point A to point B, it actually represents that. So most people are going to have a GPS and you can plot that as well, but I like to use my odometer so I can correct A to B points is correct. So if the speedo is true, I'd have to rate it at a 7 out of 10, and if it's not, it's pretty much useless to you because it's going to cost you lots of money with speeding fines.
Transmission temperatures. I don't own an automatic, but if I had an automatic, I'd be watching that thing like with a watchful eye, because transmission temperatures are probably as important as EGTs in my opinion. Keeping that in mind, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10, especially when you're on the beach doing the hard stuff and you're towing big stuff.
Transmission temperature. Look, it's only good obviously if you've got an automatic. The one you want to be watching is the heat you're producing out of the torque converter. That's the one that's doing all the work. The torque converter is the one that's going to generate the heat in the transmission. The pan temperature is the soak temperature, that's the sump for the transmission. Yes, you can monitor that. It's usually quite stable. The one you want to monitor is the torque converter, the oil coming out of the torque converter. That's the one that's doing all the hard work. It's like the big lucky band between the engine and the transmission. That's producing a lot of heat, especially when you're off-road or you're towing. So to monitor the output, what's coming out of the torque converter, you might see temperatures up to 120 degrees, whereas normal driving might be somewhere around 80 degrees. You'll get an indication of how hard you really are working the transmission. A lot of manufacturers will say the transmission's it's not serviceable, you don't need to change the oil. I totally disagree with that. If you've got 3.5 tonne of van behind you and you've just done 8,000 Ks a trip and you've towed it for all that time, I'd recommend changing the oil at least every 20,000 Ks. You're servicing everything else, service the transmission as well. It does get work just as hard. In a nutshell, transmission, temperature, and your oil. The hotter you make that oil, the life of the oil will start there. If it's in everyday normal driving conditions, it'll go 80,000 Ks or the service life. If you're towing all the time, it's going to the service period needs to be shortened up. You need to flush that oil. You're burning the oil. You're getting it above its normal operating temperature. It's something you need to monitor and keep under wraps, because it's something the transmission is an expensive item to repair. So having a gauge to monitor that, I'd have to score that an 8 out of 10.
So on your screen right now is a reflection of our results, and they are quite surprising, but when you look back and you think about what we talked about, it's not,
when
it
you
makes
score
sense.
everything individually, you're not thinking as a total and how they're going to compare against each other, but it's quite surprising now though.
Yeah, writing it down from scratch from a list without talking through it and without thinking about it, I think it would actually be a very difficult list to write.
Yeah, I don't think...
Apart from the two top ones, right?
It's like saying the boost gauge, I thought overall it might have scored higher, but realistically, as you can see with the results, what's reflected there is it's all the heat sources, and that's the things we considered to be the most critical items to keep you going further longer and, like staying, not overheating anything, because that's what's going to do the damage.
Yeah, you cook your motor, you're not going anywhere.
Yep.
What was surprising was the fuel was up so high, but this was probably more to do with touring, because we're both thinking of a touring aspect. If you're just a weekend warrior, or if you live in America and there's a gas station every corner,
as you
fuel
say,
doesn't
and
matter.
the further we go, the more fuel
fuel
costs,
matters.
and hence why you have long-range tanks and what have you. But reading them correctly and pairing that with the speedo.
And they both have to work for each other to work, because
Correct.
if the fuel gauge doesn't work, you can't calculate in a speedo. And if the speedo's out, you can't calculate your fuel. Keep that in mind, guys. That's probably a vital thing that we probably didn't mention. I think, look, I'd like to know what you guys come up with. Put it down below. Do you agree with the list, and what will your scoring be?
Yeah, definitely. Everyone has their own unique, what's special to them and what suits their needs for what they're touring or weekend worrying as well.
Just wanted to touch on this. Now, we've been reluctant to get into too much detail on this device, the scan gauge, because we would be here for another half an hour. If you would like a whole video on that, let us know. And your favourite part with an OBD reader in general?
OBD, you can take it from your car, and if your friend you're travelling with has got an engine light on or there's an issue, you can take it out of your car, plug it into their car, read what's going on, diagnose it, get you back on the road, clear an engine light. It's very universal and easy to use.
Especially if you're in limp mode.
Correct, which, maximum, limited throttle, limited power from off-road is going to take a long time to get home.
Let us know if you want that video, and we will explain what all the LOD and all the other abbreviations mean in this and how to set it up.
Yeah, there's a lot in it. So.
Yeah, there's a rabbit hole there. All right, guys, thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Cheers, Trav.
No worries.